Hey everybody, Kit Merker here from Plainisght, and I'm joined today by my very good friend Marshall Bush. Hey Marshall.
Hey, Kit, how are you?
I'm wonderful. So you just got back from Salt Lake City for KubeCon 2024, and how'd it go? How was the event?
It was great. I went there, frankly, hoping to learn a lot about AI agents and agentic software, and found very little there. I think that's less of a comment about what's happening in AI and more a comment about how Kubernetes has really matured such that it's now run more out of the ops team than the dev team. And there's sort of been a pronounced shift left, I would say, over the last three KubeCons I've attended, which would be 2019 in San Diego, last year in Chicago, and then this year in Salt Lake City. San Diego was very developer heavy. Uh, Lots of multicolored hair, lots of people who were experimenting. It was sort of very cutting edge. Last year, I should add that it was very much at that point an application management event. The word we now use would be observability, but that really wasn't widely in the lexicon then. Uh, Last year was very much a security event. All the observability players were still there, but I was hit by um, an overwhelming number of cloud security players. That's the first time that I heard sort of the consolidated CNAP term appear.
Hmm.
And this year, the shift right continued, and it was a lot of operations teams. A lot of people from places like JP Morgan running highly distributed environments, hybrid environments. Talk about you know Kubernetes in satellites, air-gapped Kubernetes on submarines, things like that. Just signs of a very mature technology, and the persona that was there was not the AI developer, not the developer at all. And I would say that on some level, it shows the success of Kubernetes, that it's become boring, and that it exists at a level much lower in the stack than where the AI developer spends his time.
So the the absence of AI at in Kubernetes ecosystem maybe showed up in the vendors and the developers, the audience that came to KubeCon, and I wonder if this is, as you're kind of saying, like a sign of maturity, or do you think they're missing the boat? Like, do you think that there's a place for AI in the Kubernetes ecosystem, or you think that this is almost like, AI is up here and Kubernetes is down here, and it's just another workload, and maybe we don't care that much at the infrastructure layer?
I would definitely say the latter. I mean, I think Capital One, who's a relatively tech forward financial institution, which is you can say that's slightly oxymoronic. I mean, I'm not trying to argue that Capital One is bleeding edge in any way, but I would say of enterprises, they are very much cutting edge. Um, they gave a presentation where they talked about, they have their machine learning platform, and on top of it, they're building a Gen AI platform. And underneath all that, it all runs on Kubernetes. But I think sort of the mechanics of that plumbing has been made invisible to the AI developer, which is actually, I would argue, a sign of success.
Yeah,
That you can become like electricity. It works, you turn it on, it doesn't fail, but you're not super concerned as a user with the source of your electricity and try to understand, how it came to be.
I think, yeah, I think one of the surprising things in the early days of Kubernetes, which for regular listeners, they'll know that I have had some involvement early on. One of the surprising things for people was that at Google we didn't really use AI to orchestrate containers or workloads in Borg. That it was really done in a much more simplistic way with this sort of continuous OODA loop, the observe, orient, decide, and act, right? That kind of continuous OODA loop of the desired behavior didn't really need AI for the optimization, but a lot of people assumed that that's what was going on under the covers. There must be some magic brain that's kind of orchestrating everything, and then Kubernetes showed that that wasn't actually the case. and really, I think, simplified people's conception of what was happening at the infrastructure layer. That being said, obviously there's a ton of AI used inside of Google and other internet scale companies at sort of one layer higher to observe the workloads and traffic patterns and anomalies and things like that, but really not at that kind of core infrastructure layer. And it is interesting that the people who gravitate toward infrastructure maybe are not the same people who are gravitating toward the cool AI, which I think most of the AI, at least that I see in the news, seems to be really more operating at the application layer, right? It's like all about use cases and prompts and interacting, especially for agents, right? Things that are very much applications and not reinventing infrastructure. At least that's my perception. I don't know if you see it, if you've seen it differently. But maybe these two worlds collide at some point. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, first, I think you hope they don't collide, because I think if they collide, it sort of means that, well, I mean, maybe taking a long view, eventually AI becomes so boring that it's completely run out of the ops team. But I think my view is more that that as Kubernetes has moved from cutting edge handled by developers to something that's much more stable handled by the ops side of the DevSecOps team, that the developers have moved on to AI. When I talked to people at the GPU clouds who had booths there, it sounded like they weren't really finding this to be a target rich environment for them, and it wasn't really their customer there. Obviously, I don't mean to speak in absolutes. If you're a tiny company, your DevSecOps might be all the same person, right? And so that would be the correct target for them. But I think with the larger enterprises, they're just different personas. And I think arguably, the point that proves that best is that Databricks didn't have a presence there. And I think that Databricks arguably understands the AI persona better than anyone out there right now. And they just didn't view this as a place they should be. They had no presence, and that looked like the right decision. And to be clear, they would label themselves, I believe, as AI infrastructure. But I think they believe that AI infrastructure exists above sort of the nitty gritty level of containerization. And I think what's interesting for me is I had, from when Alex Polvoy explained, containers to me in 2013 or 2012, and I started to look at microservices architecture, I always, in my mind, conflated the two and thought that microservices architecture and containerization were effectively the same thing. What I realized 11 years later at KubeCon is that while they often work in concert, microservices architecture, is an architecture essentially above the container level, and that when done correctly, microservices architecture should make the underlying technology invisible to the user who is simply selecting microservices and not super focused on how they actually work. So I guess why I say I hope they don't interact is because I think to the extent that agentic software becomes a microservices architecture, that ideally it operates successfully on top of infrastructure that's 5 nines reliable, and that they're not worried about the needs of their agent from from deep down in the stack any more than we're worried about what CPU is in our computer if we're browsing the internet.
Right. So I guess career advice then is, if you're worried about AI taking your tech job, you should focus on building Kubernetes and the infrastructure layer. I think that's the takeaway there. Yeah.
Exactly. Or walk around trade floor shows and ask people questions, because until robots start interviewing people, you're pretty safe.
You're irreplaceable at this point. So on this point about microservices versus containers, it's kind of an interesting, because you had mentioned this to me before the kind of the light bulb went off for you, and I think this is a common misconception. In fact, I think even the word micro in microservices confuses a lot of people what it means. It doesn't mean that the service is necessarily small. You could have a very large deployment of a microservice, but it's singular in its function, I think, is really the key, that you want to run these services. And I think one of the other kind of interesting twists of history, as you mentioned, because the whole container versus services or container versus microservices, is that Docker came before Kubernetes, which in the architectural point of view, right, you kind of need to have the orchestration layer in place. And the container is really a runtime operational concern, but Docker did a great job of bringing it as a developer concern, which I think, in a way, what you're describing in KubeCon is kind of a return to the natural order of things, that finally containers are going back to truly being an operational concern, which is what they were at Google and other places before this all became kind of public knowledge and adopted. Developers at Google didn't really think about containers all that much unless they were working on the infrastructure, and really they were more concerned about their applications and getting those applications deployed into various data centers that were being built as quickly as they could be built. And this is really what the origin story of the whole concept was in the beginning. So it's interesting that it's, in a weird way, it's taken 10 years for that to become the state of the market, but in a strange way, it was sort of always the way it should be. So there you go. I don't know. It's interesting.
Well, I mean, 10 years is fast, right? Because when you think about it, the first VMware had their first virtualization product of, the ability to virtualize an x86 architecture was in 1999. And I think it was, 14 years later in 2013 or something, they both crossed $5 billion and slowed to 13% growth. And that wasn't entirely organic. And, I remember somebody asking me, like, what happened to VMware? Why is it grown? Why did it grow 40%, 20%, 13? And I said, it kind of matured all at once. And I think that one thing that I wonder now is if you have perfect product market fit with a revolutionary or a highly disruptive, at least, infrastructure product, can it fully penetrate the market in about 15 years? And if that's true, we're 2/3 the way through containerization, and it should be ubiquitous in another 4. I mean, the flaw with that logic is that VMware didn't really force people to re-architect it all. It just allowed them to save a lot of money, and you've got to rewrite a whole lot of things to get out of, to get into a microservices containerized architecture. But ironically, you could argue that Hot Tan's purchase of VMware and huge price increases might be the accelerant that makes that happen over the next 5 years, because everybody's trying to get away from VMware as fast as they can right now.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that's right. Actually, the product adoption curve we imagine in our heads is this perfect, smooth distribution, but in reality, it's very flat, and then many times becomes very steep very quickly, and or just stays flat forever in some dead end cases. But that's hopefully not the case for everything. So other takeaways or expectations. What read the tea leaves a little bit. Like, where do you think the Kubernetes ecosystem goes, or what are you looking forward to for next year or the next maybe KubeCon Europe? What are you kind of imagining is going to be the case, or is this good? You striking this off your list? What do you think?
It might be off my list. I mean, it's so successful, it's not necessarily cutting edge, and so I'm now less going to see what the cool kids are doing and more. Now it's more an observability or a cloud security conference, and it might be the best observability conference, but I'm not sure it's the best. It's certainly not the best cloud security conference. I mean, I went to a Datadog booth, and I've been trying to do some work on observability for AI and the extent to which people are observing the infrastructure AI runs on versus actually looking into the LLMs themselves and understanding what the models are doing, which seems to be a big point of interest. And I found very little uptake. I found very few answers, and one of the reasons I found very few answers, I think, is when I went to the Datadog booth and said, "Hey, I saw your LLM observability tool at Dash in June. I'd love to see it again and ask more questions." They said, "Oh, we're actually not showing that off here," which I viewed less a statement about the success or relevance of that tool and more a statement about what Datadog saw as the audience and the attendees that were coming. So I always like KubeCon. It would make me sad to knock it off my list. Amsterdam next spring sounds fun, but I'm not sure it makes a ton of sense. Maybe I'll find some conference on agentic software that my readers will get a lot more from, and that will be more interesting. I mean, that's I'm at Microsoft Ignite right now, trying to sort of go down that rabbit hole, and it's much more fertile.
Well, we should take a second and plug your research, because I think it's really quite innovative. And I think if anyone out there wants to get Marshall's insights on KubeCon going forward, you should definitely sign up for his newsletter. But tell us a little bit about Baleen Research, because I think you've kind of stumbled onto a unique approach as a researcher.
Well, thank you. I guess it almost ties back to where we started the discussion with microservices. And I looked up one day and I thought, I'm a software analyst, and almost all modern software is microservices architecture, but all research remains massively monolithic. So if you buy into someone's view of a market, or their view of a company's growth rate, you're also buying into their biases towards management, their valuation framework, et cetera. And I think that disaggregating that is very hard. It builds in a ton of confirmation bias. It's problematic in other ways. And I think that equity research should effectively be, or technology research should be, a microservice. And so I decided to uniquely focus on software user conferences and trade shows, and go to these events, talk to as many people as I can, and boil down 30 or 40 pages of notes into, a double-sided page of takeaways. And a lot of times it's more questions than answers. It's observations. I absolutely reserve the right to say one thing at one event and then the opposite at the next event. And my view is that the people who read it are smarter than I am. They understand these things better than I do. And if I ask questions that I think are interesting, they might be able to make money, because they either know the answer or know a really good way to figure out the answer. So I try to sort of be, grounded and humble, and say, here's what I'm seeing, and it's one man's perspective. But if it's delivered in a concise enough way, and you can read it in 3 minutes, you'll probably read it, and you're better off getting 3 minutes that may be wrong than nothing at all. So, or 20 pages that you'll never read, which effectively becomes nothing at all. So that's the core concept. And I've built up a pretty big technical readership of, CEOs and salespeople. And whenever they, reply to my work, it's really flattering, because I sort of feel like at times I'm a dog watching television. And so, my summary of it, when people who really understand it are interested, it makes me excited.
I kind of think about your research kind of like the satellites that fly over the warehouses to make sure the trucks are coming and going, but for software, which is a much more invisible market, to get secondary research. And but the alternative, as I understand it, is for an investor, or your audience would be to send a junior analyst to all these events and try to compile some sort of story. But you're bringing kind of many years of expertise or experience, as well as a different lens and consistency, right? You go into these events, these people. So I think it's a huge advantage, and for a very reasonable price, I'm sure. I get the free edition, but the analysts and your clients are the ones really deriving, I think, a ton of value out of it. And also quite proud of Lexi from our team, who got one of her memes into your report, which was also, I think, one of the highlights of our year. So there you go.
Hey, I try to put a meme at the end in every note, to make sure people get to the end, sort of like dessert.
Very good. Well,
and thank you, Lexi. That was one of my favorites.
So, well, I guess just to close. So, okay, so now you're off to Chicago, or you're in Chicago. You're visiting Microsoft. Yeah, I know the event's still midway through, but any kind of hints or early observations on what's going on at Microsoft with regards to AI and copilots and all this great agent stuff?
Yeah, I mean, Microsoft is effectively doing a good job, I think, of trying to set themselves up as the connective layer, for AI and the connective tissue. One of their executives, I was asking him a question about, a an application they built really quickly that had, 4 different agents doing different tasks to, I think, answer questions on a form. And he argued that, look, the agent isn't the power here. The power is all the connectors, and we have more connectors than anyone, so we can connect you to all these things, which is sort of, I think, arguably tying back to the middle model I've been trying to use for agentic software as sort of microservices with APIs. And I guess the other thing that I find interesting and potentially troubling is that it. I think last year the story at Microsoft was we were forward looking. We saw over the horizon. We knew AI was coming. We had a deep partnership with Databricks. We were the first people to jump at OpenAI, and Microsoft was the way that you access all of these. That you access the best AI tools, and we're the easiest environment to do that in. I noticed in Satya's keynote yesterday there were no mentions of Databricks. OpenAI was hardly mentioned, and it looks like they're pushing people to first-party services more and more, which it feels a little too early to get that greedy, and I wonder if that hampers their progress. Sort of like, if you call the concierge and you say, I'd like to get a great steak, and he recommends, Deuces on the second floor, which serves breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You start to think maybe this guy isn't an honest broker and is just trying to get me to spend all my money at his hotel. I don't know that I want more, recommendations from him. And I guess I worry that if Microsoft is sort of trying to disintermediate the partners that got them their leadership position in AI this early in the process, it could backfire.
Yeah, so trying to decide which technology era this harkens back to. Is this the desktop wars? Is this the cloud wars? Is this productivity software? But maybe in 2024, looking forward, all big tech is advertising at the bottom. Like if you peel back all the layers of everything, it all comes down to eyeballs and advertising. You think that's what's going on?
It could be. I'll have to think through that. You're quicker than I am at this stuff, but I'll noodle on that and get back to you.
All right. Well, enjoy the rest of your event, Marshall. And for people who want to find out about your report, how do they get? You have a super secret website, I think, right? How do people find you?
I'm at baleenresearch.com, BALEEN research.com. I'm Marshall Bush on LinkedIn. I'm Baleen Research on Twitter. I'm relatively easy to find for someone who's largely obscure.
There you go. Well, thanks, Marshall. And for all you out there, thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.
Always a pleasure.
Marshall.